Welcome, everyone. This is the first conversation in our Mobilize series for 2023, and it's called Placemaking, Shaping a More Vibrant and Accessible City. So we're going to start with introducing our presenter and move into their presentation and then get into a discussion followed by audience Q&A. If you have any questions or comments or ideas or thoughts throughout the course of the presentation, please feel free to start adding them and throwing them into the chat. And we're going to try our best to get through most of them, if possible, at the end of the presentation. So for the Mobilize series, we are exploring the ways and the means in which we get around our cities and our communities. So in Jamaica, a supermajority of residents in the Kingston metropolitan area do not own cars, nor use them as their primary mode of transportation. Despite this, the infrastructure that makes up our transportation network is specifically designed to advantage private car use over all other alternatives. So with a transportation system that is distinctly car dependent and lacks alternatives, getting around the city is a major source of frustration for us all. So whether you drive, whether you take the bus or you walk, moving through our cities is any combination of expensive, unpredictable, time-consuming, and increasingly more dangerous. And we understand that this is experienced in Kingston, but we imagine it's very similar across Caribbean cities. So the Mobilize webinar series aims to really explore the ways in which peer cities are transforming their transportation systems to be more efficient, to be more safe, and to be more equitable for all. So my name is Doreen Duncan. I am one of the founders of Island City Lab. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our programming, we are a Kingston-based urban planning think tank that's really dedicated to understanding the unique features and challenges of small island cities in the Caribbean. Our aim is really to improve our built environment by building, fostering, and convening a network of civic thinkers like you all on the call to really confront these challenges. So this forum is a part of that programming. So today we are in conversation with someone who has dedicated almost all of his professional career to really exploring and understanding mobility and transportation in cities across the world. So Dr. Norman Garrick is a professor emeritus in civil engineering and the co-director of the Sustainable Cities Research Group at the University of Connecticut. His research focuses on street networks and their impact on traffic safety, the negative impacts of parking on cities, and factors contributing to traffic fatalities in the US and other countries. He also studies the societal impact of things like autonomous vehicles and street design for both pedestrian and bicyclist safety. He also studies things like transportation costs and their implications for equity. His research features in forums such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Bloomberg, The Guardian. He has twice been invited to serve as a visiting professor at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and has taught classes at MIT, at Oxford University, and locally here at UA in Jamaica. So Dr. Garrick has also consulted on various urban projects that includes Hurricane Katrina reconstruction, redevelopment in Freetown, Sierra Leone, urban infill projects, and transportation assessment. He was a lead contributor to the Institute of Congress for the New Urbanism Street Design Manual. He's a fellow of the Congress of New Urbanism, which he also served on its national board for 8 years. But beyond all of that, he's also Jamaican and a son of Spanish Town. So with that very hefty introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Garrick.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first share my screen, then I'll jump right into it. Share. Okay, here we go. So I'm really excited to be part of this discussion because a lot of what I've done in my career is shaped by the fact that I grew up in Kingston, and I've seen the evolution of Kingston, and in many ways, it's a little bit shocking, the changes from growing up in Kingston in the 70s till now. And it's really shaped what I study and how I studied. So to be able to talk about some of my research in that context is really good. One of the things that I should say is that I've not been to Jamaica since 2016, and things keeps changing there, and I'm looking forward to being back. So what I wanted to start out with is a New York Times article that was published 2 years ago. And I am proud of this article because it was firstly a front page on the New York Times. It also featured my research, and it quoted me extensively on this front page article. And it really got a lot of publicity in the US. But beyond all of that is the fact that for the first time, I've been working on this thing called freeway removal since around 2007. And at first it was very backwaters. Nobody was taken seriously. And this New York Times article signaled that it was all of a sudden serious. And just 2 years later, or a year later, the Biden administration was putting lots of funds into studying and into removing freeways. So you can see how far this issue has come. But the real reason why I wanted to present this is that this article is an acknowledgement of how damaging the method that we have used in developing a transportation structure, how damaging it has been to American cities. And the New York Times article had these wonderful interactive maps showing American cities before and after freeways, and just the sheer devastation in cities all over the country. And so this is part of why this conversation has taken off in the US. And I think one of the sad things is that this export of American attitude towards transportation is still seen as something to model in places, a lot of places around the world, including the Caribbean. So this is what the article said. It talks about how cities try to accommodate cars by essentially destroying themselves. That was the quote I gave. And the example was of Rochester, New York, where I had worked with that city in helping them conceptualize how they would remove a freeway that essentially choked their downtown. And the New York Times article really drew on some of the methods that we use in our research. For example, methods such as essentially reconstructing cities. This is the city of Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1913. And it was, blue is commercial, purple mixed use, green residential. Currently, this city is an absolute wasteland. Most of that, the red you see there is parking lots, and the gray are freeways. So you can see the extent to which this city, in fact, this city just applied a few years ago for bankruptcy protection because it had so destroyed itself that it was unable to pay its bill. This is a video that came out about 4 or 5 years ago. Actually, I was living in Zurich at the time, and people were appalled to see this image of just the sheer madness of car dependency in the US. And I was also appalled by what I saw. But when I looked at the video more carefully, this is in LA, and you look at the amount of cars and you understand that this is madness. But if you, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you look up here, right here, something else is going on that I think is really incredible. Oh, let's go back. Okay. Yeah, it's the fact that LA has been building out a system of streetcars and subways because they realize that this is madness. It's not just people in Europe look at this and laugh at the craziness of America. Even LA recognize that this is not working. So one of the messages I want to get across to you in this presentation is that even America no longer wants to be like America. And we are seeing these changes taking hold in city after city, probably not at the rate that they should be taking hold, but certainly people are understanding that the old method of doing transportation is insane. So I just wanted to start this presentation by talking about an experience I had around in 2004. 2004 was my second sabbatical from my university job, and I decided to spend 4 months as a Fulbright scholar at Mona. And this was a very seminal experience for me. It really changed my understanding of transportation. It really made me understand how closely transportation was tied to economic issues, to social issues, etc., by being in Kingston, by being in Mona without a car. One of the interesting things was when I was at Mona without a car, I would have to pass through this market every day. And that's where I would shop. I would shop in Pepin. For the last month of my stay, I got a car, and all of a sudden, it was much easier to shop at the supermarket. So I was no longer part of a local economy having a car. I was part of the import economy. And that to me was really an educational experience. I also thought about scenes like this that you see in downtown Kingston, where people are self-employed and can do jobs like this because the streets allow it. This would not be possible in uptown Kingston. So what we have done is created an economy, a transportation system that favors one type of economic being, and it's the type of economic being that is not doing any good for Jamaica, because it's a type of economic system that is all about importing things from America and China and Europe. The other thing was this scene again. This is the colonial in 1800s King Street. And we think about colonialism and all its fault, and I don't come to praise colonialists, but in the 1800s, there were no cars, so you had to build in concert with nature. And so, of course, we had the building of streets like this that took into account the fact that Jamaica is a tropical island. So things like that was very instrumental in really changing how I thought about transportation and how I would research transportation going forward when I got back to the US. This is a book written by a Uruguayan author. And what he says is Latin Americans who don't own a car and can never hope to buy one lived engulfed in traffic and suffocated by smog. And he's saying Latin Americans, but think about it, this could well be Kingston that he's talking about. He goes on to say that sidewalks shrink and disappear altogether, distances increase, so you need a car, more people cross paths, while fewer and fewer people meet. And that's the Kingston that whenever I've come back to, I've seen the changes, and we keep moving more and more in this direction. So how do I know that we have been following along this path? Well, let's ask ourselves a few questions. Firstly, who are the streets being built for? This is what we have abandoned downtown Kingston, basically. And this is what we aspire to as modernity. This place that is built, it's with disrespect for people walking, but it's also about a 40-mile-per-hour street, which is really dangerous. What these people are doing at this location, downtown is fine. Doing their here is probably not a good idea. This gentleman, I look at him and I think, really brave man in the center of half a tree trying to get around on a bicycle. We just don't facilitate this kind of travel in Jamaica. And of course, these kids trying to cross the road at Hagley Park Road, and just again, it's not for them that this facility is built. So the second question that is really interesting to ask is, are things easy to get to by foot? Have we built in such a way that we can get to school, that we can get to shopping, that we can get to work on foot or by bike? And the way that we have built over the last 50, 60, 70 years, we have housing being constructed or even new towns, but without facility for people, except for living spaces. We have not built the infrastructure where people can live and work in a place like Portmore. So for example, one of the statistics I found interesting was this idea that it's the average distance to school in Jamaica is 6 miles. That means you are either going to be driven there or you have to somehow get there by public transportation. And in Kingston, that is bad enough, but in the rest of the country, it's just horrific. And then this issue of we are celebrated for a beach, but most people without cars, there is no way that they can get to beach. When I was growing up in Kingston, I grew up partly in Rockfort, we could walk to the Beaumont Beach, we could go to Gunboat Beach, but there are lots of issues that have led to that not being the case now. So how do we facilitate people getting to recreational areas? It's virtually impossible unless you drive. The third question, very quickly, is getting around. And the question I would ask is public transportation designed for everyone or just for the poor? And you can answer that question yourself. I remember when I was going to Jamaica, I went to the embassy as a Fulbright scholar of urbanism. And the lady in the office, the American lady in the office, told me, don't use public transportation. That speaks for itself. So just some other images of public transportation at the time. In around 2007, I was invited by the Jamaican Chamber of Commerce to give a speech with a colleague from America. And at the time, I was able to get funding from the World Bank to invite Enrique Peñalosa, who was the mayor of Bogota, that started some really important changes in that city. And this is Enrique in Rosetown. And he is famous around the world for saying that an advanced city is one where the poor moves about in cars, rather it's where even the rich use public transportation. So an advanced city is not one where the poor moves about in car, but rather it is where even the rich use public transportation. And that's become worldwide known, and it is true. I am actually now living in Zurich, Switzerland, and I can attest to the fact that here everybody uses public transportation. Okay. It seems to be frozen. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. Everything seems to be frozen up. Let me just stop sharing a bit. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you. We're hearing you,
Yeah.
Professor Dan. Maybe just
Yeah, but
unshare. Share
so
again.
let me just start it again because I wasn't sure why it's frozen.
Okay.
All right. So, okay, there you go. Okay, so then the third question I want to ask is, how does our government spend money? What is the public policy towards transportation? And I don't know if many of you know this scene, but this is the Kingston terminus of the railroad that once run. It was the third oldest railroad in the Western Hemisphere, started in 1848. It stopped running, I believe, around 1989 after a hurricane. and it was never reactivated. And part of the issue had to do with the fact that when we signed a deal with a French company to build Highway 2000, one of the the conditions was that we were not allowed to reinstall this railroad track. So there's no money being put into anything but highways right now. And again, we're frozen. I don't know.
Would you like me to share, Professor Garrick?
Let me try and see.
Okay.
And see what happens. Okay. And another part of this story is what has happened to our town centers. I mean, the story of Kingston, downtown Kingston, is well known, but my hometown, the place I spent much of my adolescent life in, Spanish Town, is just an amazing story of just the loss of fabric and the abandonment of that old fabric that had many of the amenities that would make it possible to live without a car. So one of the interesting things about how we are spending money is the fact that less than a quarter of households in Jamaica have access to a car. And I think it's interesting because if you look at the distribution of who has cars, it's really skewed towards the people, the highest fifth percentile of people in the country. And I compared this to the US, where almost all sector of the population have cars. So it made some kind of, it was not as ridiculous that the US went in this car-oriented way, because more of the people had cars, although the research we are doing now shows that a lot of the poorer people in the US struggle to afford cars. So even in the US, that is the case. But when you look at the Jamaican situation, where so few people had cars, you have to wonder, what sense does it make to be spending almost all of our transportation budget on cars and car facilities? And then the other thing that I find fascinating is looking where we know how distorted the income disparity in Jamaica is. But one thing that is interesting is the cost and who can afford the cost of cars, of operating a cars. Very, very, very few people can afford cars in Jamaica without stretching their budget. And yet, so what that ends up with is that we, in order to afford a car, we have created a city of clunkers, a city where people can only afford to operate second-hand, older vehicles that are really on their last leg. And I'm talking about this from firsthand because I remember when I came back from UWI, in 1978, my first car was a white VW just like this. And I remember that I wasn't paying rent at the time. I was living with my parents. And yet I had no money to spend because all my money was being poured into this ridiculous vehicle. So all of my adult life, I've lived in places where I needed to have a car. I lived in Jamaica. I lived in Indiana in the US, and I lived in Connecticut in the US. For the first time in my adult life, I'm living in a place where I don't need to have a car. And one of the things, one of the reasons I'm sharing with you is that one of the, we often hear the mantra that cars are about freedom. I have never felt so free in my life to be able to access things, to go to places, etc. I never have to think about it. I just walk out the door and I can go into the Alps. I can go almost anywhere in the country I feel like, without even planning or thinking about it. So, but it's not just that cars are impoverishing individuals. It also has impoverished our country. I was looking at the numbers, and these are numbers that I verified by looking at an article from the Gleaner. And I think this is an underestimation, but about 20% of our import is being spent for cars, for fuel for cars, and for parts for cars. And part of this shocking story here is that this is more than we're spending for food, and it's slightly smaller than the entire export income that we're gaining from everything we can export. So we're basically building stuff and sending it abroad so that we can support our car habit. When I was preparing for this presentation, there was this editorial in the Gleaner, and it is arguing rather meekly that we need to be shifting how we do things in America. And one of the things that amused me here is that it compared numbers for car importation and for the transit, and it gave the numbers for transit in Jamaican dollars and the car importation in US dollars, just to show the sheer magnitude of the difference. So I thought I would show that in a graph. So transit spending looks like that, and car-related imports look like that currently in Jamaica. So the disproportionate amount that we're spending on cars is just really somewhat unbelievable. But yet we see that our government is doubling down on what is now seen in the US as a failed policy, when the legacy projects is one example of that. And the legacy project, this is how it's being sold, is meant to enhance the quality of life and to stimulate economic growth. If it's forcing us to send all our money to foreign countries, I'm not sure how that works as an economic growth engine. As to quality of life, I found this picture years ago of downtown Kingston, of King Street, from around the turn of the century. And I look at this public space and I'm thinking, these people, 80 years out of slavery, and I look at the public space that they had compared to the type of public space that we're providing now for people living in supposedly a modern, high quality of life place. They further try to sell these projects by talking about the improvement, the upgrade, the improvement. And I really want you to when you see things like this, to really push back and ask, this, for whom is this an improvement? Is it an improvement for the majority of citizens in this city? The fact that you can't cross this road when it's done, the fact that you're likely to be trying to get from one side to the other, you're likely to be killed. Who is this being improved for? The smog that you must breathe in daily, the dirt and the grit. I remember when I lived in Mona, I actually feared going into this because I know how it feels to be in this condition. It's not that I don't like Kingston, but just the sense of being dirty was palpable for me. The NWA also talks about traffic flow. And the question I would have is, are these people not traffic also? Are they not also trying to get around the city? And do they not deserve space in our city? and they're getting less and less of the space that is available. The public space is going all to the movement of cars. So one of the things that has been happening over the last 5 years, and you might be or might not be aware of it, we're almost at 500 people being killed each year in traffic accidents. And this is not a surprise. This is a consequence of policies that are designed for moving traffic. And you see it again all over the world. You see it in states in America that favor traffic over people versus states that are more towards favoring people. They're very different, for example, between Connecticut and Alabama. So I just wanted to add this to this graph. The transit spending is there. There was an estimate of the cost of fatality and injury, and it looks like that. And the car-related imports look like that. And the cost of fatality and injury, there was an estimate that said it's about 10% of the entire cost for hospitalization in Jamaica. So many places, including the city that I live in now, Zurich, Switzerland, has flipped the switch. They used to be more like this, and they have moved to being more like this. And I see this in the future for Kingston, that we start to pay more attention to people rather than just the interests that want to keep us in steel boxes, or at least those of us that can afford steel boxes. And there are many, many interests that are about keeping us in steel boxes. What we need are people like what we have here, like the organizers of this seminar, like you all, that need to be pushing back. And that's how change happens. And that's how change has happened in Switzerland. It has happened in places like Portland. So to talk about the change that is needed, what I've put forth is what I'm calling the Jamaican model of transportation and urban planning. And I'm not going to talk at length about this, but just very quickly, compact settlements, complete settlements, as opposed to what we had with Portmore, for example, functioning town centers like Spanish Town, like Black River, etc., that have had the economic life sucked out of them, affordable and dignified travel for all, not the scenes of crowding, overcrowded buses that we see daily in Kingston, safe travel that is about safety first and not about moving vehicles, and treating the streets as public spaces, as comfortable places, tree-lined streets where we can feel comfortable. And then lastly, keep transportation money locally. Not build a transportation system that is all about supporting the United States, is all about supporting China, is all about supporting Saudi Arabia. So I want to just end by showing how this has been done in other places. This is Portland, Oregon in the 1970s. It was a place that was dying and losing population at a tremendous rate. You can see that so much land was fallow along this freeway. In the 1970s, at the behest of a Republican governor, at the time Republicans did things like this, they came up with a plan that was called the Willamette Valley Choices for the Future. And that plan, if you read it, has all of the 7 elements that I talked about for a model, a Jamaican model. And they have worked assiduously to put this plan in place. So they got rid of the freeway along the waterfront. It's pictures of that freeway coming down in the 70s. They got things like they were the first cities to restore streetcar service in 1981. They started a different kind of streetcar. They have suburban rails. They started working on the streets. They started giving facility for biking. Now they are one of the stronger biking cities in the country. So they've changed the paradigm. And that has resulted, this is the waterfront, that has resulted in a city that is extremely desirable. The population is exploding. The problems they have now is that there are too many people being attracted to this city. And so they have an affordability crisis. So the changes that we're talking about, it's not a pipe dream. It can be done. It was done here in Switzerland. In much of this, when you look at the places that these changes have occurred, you see that they follow the same script. The agent for change is not always the same. In Portland, political leaders led the change. In Zurich, it was people voting down big highway projects. In a lot of places, it's about advocates speaking up and saying, enough is enough, we want a different way. So we are at the first step, I would say, where we are in Jamaica, but these changes are possible. And that's where I want to leave it. So thank you very much for your attention. And I turn it over to you, Doreen.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Norman. I want to quickly jump into discussion questions because I'm seeing some in the chat. And ask folks, if you already have some thoughts, some questions, please put them in there. We'll try to get towards them at the end. But my first question is really about the kind of legacy of this American style development that we are replicating, not just in Jamaica, not just in Kingston, but across lots of English speaking Caribbean countries. So we've had people talk about these issues in Bahamas, in Nassau, in Port of Spain. So it's a regional issue, right? So this type of car-centric transportation that you described, which has been typical to American cities since around the 50s, what are American citizens and American communities really discovering now that is kind of spurring a change or spurring the desire to have your cities and your communities look very different?
Well, I think it's a whole range of issues. It starts with the fact that we are getting to the point where we can't afford to maintain the infrastructure that we built. So that's one big driver. The other one is that people are just appalled by the amount of people that get killed on the streets in America. In America, the amount of people being killed is 3, 4, 5, 6 times more than on a per capita basis, more than most other countries with that level of income. People are just, this week I have a group of 9 American students, and their eyes just lit up when they see the situation in Zurich because they're from suburbia and they've never had that kind of independence in terms of getting around. So lots and lots of things are playing into this. The fact that transportation costs so many people so much money out of pocket and they're not able to afford it is all also coming to play.
So for these next set of questions, I just want to kind of reiterate some facts that you had in the presentation, which I think is really important context, right? So one, a supermajority of residents in Kingston and St. Andrew. When we say supermajority, we say it's actually 74% of that population do not own cars nor use them as their primary mode of transportation. And that's based on the last census, but I'm pretty sure the census that's taking place now is going to have a similar number, right? So that's fact number one. Fact number two, the transportation system has an unfair bias towards private motor cars, as you described, right? So in your presentation, you used words such as just and fair and dignity, which are words that you don't really expect to hear in a conversation around transportation, and especially not from an engineer, no offense, right? So how, and I guess why has the discourse around transportation in the US moved to be talking more about equity?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to start with that question. For me, the change came when, as I said, when I lived in Kingston in 2004, is when I started to understand. Because in America, you can actually divorce yourself from just how much impact having a car-centric transportation system have on people around you. You don't see it so directly as you do in Jamaica. So it's been slow for that to build in the US. Um, but the second thing is that true in engineering school is all about efficiency and movement and quick and all of those things. It's just now slowly that people are trying to understand that transportation is not about those things. It's about how people live, is about the fairness of how they live, is about the health of how they live. So even today, most transportation programs do not talk about things like equity. So, but more and more people are pushing back and making the case that transportation has to be about its effect on people's life. So that's the change that we're seeing. And that's the change that we certainly need in engineering school all over the world. I know it's not there yet.
Hopefully the engineers on the call are agreeing with you. So I have one more question from my list, and then I'm going to jump into the Q&A. But making a broad assumption here, for those of us perhaps on this call who are a part of this kind of privileged minority who can afford to buy and can afford to maintain a car, why should we really want to reshape or retrofit our city with cars not being at the center, especially if that means us as car drivers are going to be made worse off? Why would we want this type of, new city, new community?
Well, I think the easiest way for me to explain is for them to come to Zurich. I explain the difference in the quality of life. Well, firstly, keep building big roads, and I don't think the cars are moving any faster in Kingston, is it? The pollution in Kingston, everybody has to put up with that. The fact that we don't have really pleasant public spaces in Kingston, everybody suffers from that. So, it goes on and on. And also the fact that for most people, it's really putting such a burden on their income, their pocketbook. But the problem in Jamaica, the way that car-centric development was possible in the US was on the back of racism. It was largely on the back of racism that they were successful to sell the idea. In Jamaica, it's something else. It's about class. I remember years ago, somebody told me that I don't have a car, and because I don't have a car, I have to dress better for people to take me serious. So it's a really difficult thing in a place like Jamaica, where the sense of having a car is about where you are in life. It's part of your presentation to the world. So that's what is going to make it difficult. And the idea that cars and roads are about modernity, all of those things are things that we have to battle if we're going to change.
Yeah. So I want to kind of switch a conversation. So this question is from Davey in the chat. As someone who has experienced and knows many women or femme-presenting persons who have experienced sexual violence on Jamaica's public transportation, what are your recommendations or examples to really deal with that? And they brought up an example from India where they have women-only buses or women-only train cars. What are your kind of thoughts? Because I think throughout our work talking about transportation in Jamaica, especially from women, safety and perceptions of safety is one of the biggest hurdles that we keep on hearing, and they're valid reasons.
I don't have an easy answer. I don't think there's an easy answer to tackling that, but it's a country where the perception of lack of safety is not just in public transportation, it's also in your cars. I mean, I remember driving up to the stoplight at Waterloo, And I don't feel safe when people are crowding around your cars and trying to sell you services that you don't need and all of that. So it's that is a problem that is always going to get in the way of making changes, because we associate crime and criminality with being in public in Jamaica, but it's really I don't think that people in their cars are that much safer. So it is something that has to be dealt with on the broader societal problem that I don't have easy answers for.
Yeah, yeah. We have another question here about policy changes. So Kimberly Burrows was asking, can you speak to how the Jamaican government could enable more walkability through transportation policy? But I also want to kind of add to that question around us being in, I guess, a context of perpetual resource scarcity, right? We always hear we don't have the money to do this and we don't have the money to do that. But what are some of the policies that you think can start transforming cities and transforming communities, really quickly?
Well, that's such an ironic.
That don't require large spending on infrastructure.
But we just finished large spending on infrastructure to make the road less safe. In the same way that we can spend large amounts on infrastructure that makes the road more less safe, there are also lenders or agencies that are willing to reverse that, to start looking at safety, etc., to start making those changes. And actually, the spending that is needed to make the road safer is generally less than the spending that we need to make it more car-centric. So it's not a question so much as of resources as to how we spend the resources. When I look at the amount of money that was spent on Hagley Park Road, for example, to make it a legacy road, it's really appalling. And that's why I put that the comparison of how much money is spent on transit versus how much money is spent on importing cars. One of the interesting things about that money is that most of the money for importing cars goes somewhere else. A lot of the transit money stay in Jamaica. So it's not even the same type of money. And we need to have a policy discussion about that. When we spend money on transit, it's paying people in Jamaica. The money is staying in Jamaica. When we spend money on cars, the money is going to oil producing places and car producing places. It's not helping Jamaica. So it's really about understanding the implication of all of what we're doing.
Yeah, yeah. So I have a question here from Honor Ford Smith. Are there models from other indebted global South countries or cities that meet the criteria for transit that serves all people, regardless of class or race?
I think the best examples are, well, the ones that are a few decades old are from Brazil, in Curitiba, for example. From Buenos Aires has done a lot of changes. From Bogota, in terms of making it possible to get around by bikes. We're seeing some changes in some Indian cities, and there are some African cities that are also making good change in terms of transit.
Okay. And I just want to highlight that we'll be bringing in and having conversations with people in these peer cities. So the next conversation, we're going to be bringing up a transportation planner from Medellin, Colombia, to talk about their transportation.
Oh yes, Medellin is a great place.
It is. And then we're also going to be having another transportation planner who works on cycling and pedestrianization in Nairobi, Kenya. So stay tuned for those conversations.
Another place that is also, there are movements in the right direction is Mexico and Mexico City. And they have to deal with some of the same crime issues that we have in Kingston.
Yeah. And I just kind of want to circle back to the question of women's perception of safety on public transportation. We have another person, Keon Webley, talking about her experience on the bus and feeling that now that she's driving, it definitely feels significantly safer. And I want to kind of go back to one of the slides that you had around who are we expecting to take our public transportation, right? Because when people go on, say, a Knutsford Express, which is it is a bus, right? It
Public
is a
transit.
bus.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
People feel significantly safer, right? And that's a sort
Yes.
of investment in safety, security, also just the general investments that you feel that allow you to feel safer as a woman on a Knutsford traveling by yourself than on a JUTC. And I think to your point around investments and investing, like uptown people are taking JUTC, and investing like people can choose to take JUTC as opposed to people who have no choice, right? I think that will go a long way in changing the experience
The
of women
perception.
and children. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, another part of that is just the share. When a vehicle is overcrowded, nobody feels safe on it. And I remember when I was going to Excelsior and learning the skill to be at the exact right place to be able to get on the bus. You know, you shouldn't have to be able to do that as a school child to be able to get to school. But that idea of overcrowding, a lot of the sense of unsafety comes from that.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of other questions. So we have a question from Catherine Agong, who's transportation engineer in Trinidad. What tips can Norman share for effective advocacy and communication with decision makers and politicians who influence the transportation system?
Yeah. I think you kind of you hit the nail on the head with your first question, is this issue of changing the focus. You don't talk in the terms that engineers or that car advocate people want you to talk about, because all they want you to talk about is congestion, is speeds, is and so on. You need to be able to talk about what transportation does. And that goes back to a question that was asked when we were starting to build the freeway in America. There was an American writer that asked the question, what is transportation for? And if you think it's just about moving people, then you'll do anything. But if you understand that it has all of these different impacts on society, then you start to ask different questions. So really keeping at the forefront of what it is you're trying to achieve is, I think that's how I've seen change happen. I started writing in Connecticut maybe 20 years ago about some of these things, and just keep hammering at these points is how you start getting people to question the status quo and to ask the right questions.
Yeah, because I think that's a really good point, right? What is the purpose of transportation, right?
What is transportation for? Yes.
Yeah, it's not to get you somewhere fast, it's to get you to a specific
Yeah.
location. So you can do things, you can see people. So there's an end goal. And it seems like if we are always talking about efficiency and congestion and speed, that we
Yes.
kind of ignore the end goal that we're trying to reach to.
Yeah, and especially again in a place where most people don't have access to cars. Why is there so much focus on congestion? I mean, it's some people, but of course, it's the people with the access to the newspapers and the access to the politicians that are affected. So that is the problem in Jamaica, is in.
So we're running out of time, but I'm going to read a couple of these comments together and maybe respond to them after. So Rachel Goff in the chat is saying, in addition to the sort of quick reorientation, policy and budget, I think for issues of interpersonal safety, we also need a deep transformation that prioritizes everyone's dignity. And I think getting back to this kind of new change, or not, let me say new change, but the change in language that we want to be included in transportation, talking about dignity, right? ITDP, which is a International Transportation Development, I'm forgetting what the P stands for, but the International Organization for Transportation, they have lots of sort of conversations around transportation specifically for women and caregivers. And that if you can design a transportation system, if you can design spaces specifically for women and children, that necessarily it's going to be better for everyone else. So I think the conversations around what dignified means is extremely important. We have Christina Neal talking about Knutsford is concerned private transport, so profit drives the experience and the function, valid. I am worried that the Jamaican government does not see effective public transportation outside of urban Kingston as having any benefit to them. And then we
well, I don't see it as having any benefit in Kingston either.
Mm-hmm.
Given the level of the government on the transit in Kingston, only a fraction of that comes from the government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in most countries, the Gleaner article keeps talking about profit. When you provide transit, transit is not, it's a public good. We shouldn't be talking about profit. We should be talking about what is needed to provide a level of service that gives people dignity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then we have this other question, which is a bit different from the rest of them. It's from Christina Godfrey. I feel punished by living outside of urban spaces, taxed by highways, shuttle services, removed from my options. It's really disheartening. We are forced to get a private car. Public transportation was no longer a viable option for my well-being. Portmore, which is a satellite city for those of you who don't know, outside of Kingston, Portmore is now developing, and I see less concern about inclusion or public forums that include citizens. So I guess the question there is kind of around engagement. How do citizens sort of advocate for these type of options, especially if you're living in a place like Portmore or in Spanish Town that are not in the kind of urban core that we think of?
Well, that's a really interesting question because Portmore is as urban as it gets, but it doesn't have the facility. It doesn't, there are lots of things. When we start talking about the issue of transportation, a lot of other things come into play, like policies around where you put schools. Like I was thinking earlier today about in Port Antonio, you had a potential question about Port Antonio being a somewhat functioning urban areas. But I remember one of the things that the government did there was they took the courthouse from the center of Port Antonio and put it 2 miles out of the city. So things like that, where you put public facilities, for example, is all part of this discussion. It's like, how are people going to get out to the courthouse? Do they walk there? There's no bus running out there. You have to have a car. So again, it's not about for the people of that city. So where we put public facilities, what type of shops, etc., do we build? Portmore is interesting because it was built as just residential, but people have turned a lot of those residential places into commerce, doctor's office, etc. So Jamaicans tend to find a way in some things that they can control. But yes, we need the government to be buying into places that are mixed, like how people have created more of a mix, a kind of mixed texture in Portmore.
And I'm going to end on this question, right? From Julian Menko. He's a student studying urban planning, master's degree in Singapore, but he's from Cayman Islands. He's asking, do we see an opportunity for a more coordinated sort of Caribbean regional collaboration to achieve some of these goals, whether through sort of bottom-up approaches? What do you think about a a more Caribbean focused kind of approach to advocacy, because I think that's where we need to be right now, right?
I think it's partly about advocacy, which is what I think that you all are working on. But I think it's also about the educational system. We do share some educational instruments. So using those and trying to get a different sense of what we're teaching in schools, that's really important. So yes, and also learning from each other, I think is also very important. So the sense that we can work together is fundamental, I think.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'm gonna wrap up here because I know that we're at time. But I want to thank you so much, Professor Garrick, for participating, for crafting this narrative alongside us and sharing your expertise. And thank you to everyone who kind of showed up today and asked questions and was interested in this conversation. All of our events, our Island City Lab events, are recorded and will be posted to the Island City Lab YouTube page. Give us a couple of weeks. Also, as a reminder, this is just the first of 4 webinars in the Mobilize series. So please look out in the coming weeks for promotion and Eventbrite links for the following conversations. So I think this conversation was really helpful because it was a primer to the following conversations, which include mass transit, one about active transportation, which is really about pedestrianization and cycling, and the last one, which is about tactical urbanism, which is really how do we start to do some of these things now with cheap materials without waiting for a massive loan. So thank you again, Dr. Garrick. If you have any last
pleasure.
words,
thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you so much, guys. Look forward to talking to you guys soon.